And I am a guy that started watching in the late 70s, and I certainly loved watching the likes of a Drew Bledsoe or a number of quarterbacks, Dan Marino, who could barely move. They could move well in the pocket, but they were no running threat, just deliver the ball downfield. I love watching that style of play. But Don, give us an idea of the stress that it puts on a defense. Number one, to have a running threat at quarterback, but more so in today's game in the last, 10 to 15 years with all this RPO action where somebody determined at one point, and I think they determined it by watching the wing T back in the 40s, watching old films in black and white to say, you know what, instead of playing 10 on 11, we can play 11 on 11, make the quarterback a threat. And now the defense has to account for him as well, and the stress that puts on a defense when the quarterback's, he doesn't have to be Vince Young or Michael Vick, but he's a threat to run.
I think a good example where that shows up, Mark, would be in the NFL right now. Let's face it, there's a movement toward mobile quarterbacks, and they don't have to all run 4 or 5 in the 40. A good example is Josh Allen. Josh Allen is a force as a runner. And it just simply adds another dimension to the Buffalo Bills. It's one reason their offense is as difficult to defend as it is. But there are other examples, of course. Mahomes is a great example. He's able to buy time in so many different ways. He's able to throw the ball in all kinds of positions. Here's a great example. How about the little guy with Arizona? I mean, I didn't think a guy that short could play in the NFL, but he's doing it, and he's doing it well.
I believe he was at the Mavericks game last night, Don. Showed him on TNT. And so switching Erica's question about switching off QBs and having two, it just doesn't seem to me that that's what Brian or Kirk want. They want to be able to decide on a guy as much as we may think it's a good idea at times. I don't see that happening. Do you have any thoughts?
I think it's a great idea. And it never bothered me to have two different skill sets, one quarterback versus the other. Because let's face it, if let's imagine that the pocket passer is the starter. Well, if the backup is the runner or the combination quarterback, now go ahead and put him in the game for selected snaps. The other team doesn't know what those snaps are. Prime example would be Purdue this past year against Iowa. You remember what happened, Corey and Mark, you may not be aware. Purdue actually played 3 different quarterbacks against Iowa. And I guarantee you those snaps for the second and third quarterbacks, those quarterbacks knew before the game ever started what those plays were going to be. So it simply gave them a more varied attack versus Iowa because they had to introduce 2 other quarterbacks to be able to get those plays into the game. The starter couldn't run them as well as those backups could. And all 3 of them played in the game and all had significant snaps.
And for those out there that may think that Petrus is lighting the world on fire in practice and then not showing up in the game, I guess that's possible. And it's also possible that a guy who's not playing as well in practice would play very well on game day. Can you give us a specific example of a quarterback during your era at Iowa, Don, who didn't have the greatest practice but showed up on game day?
I think Chuck Hartley would be an example of that, I think. Chuck always played well in games, but sometimes in practice. And Chuck would even say, you know what, Coach, you're right. I didn't do very well today. But he was always ready to play in the game. Here's a prime example as a place kicker. Remember Rob Haltman, who kicked the game-winning field goal in 1985 when we were number 1 ranked against number 2 Michigan. And he had a lot of game-winning kicks. Believe it or not, Rob Haltman didn't kick that well in practice. Some guys play better in games. Some guys embrace the moment, and thrive on pressure. Other guys tend to wilt under pressure. And you better know which category they're in because you don't want to send that guy that can't handle pressure. You don't want to send him on the field. And I always was able to say this about Chuck Long and Matt Rogers came to mind. Matt Rogers was a 2-time All-Big Ten quarterback. I said if the game's down to 1 play, their pulse rate's going to go up about that much, just a little bit. Those are the same guys. If they weren't playing quarterback, they should have gone to med school because they would have also made great heart surgeons. They're good under pressure. Some people are good under pressure. Some people fold under pressure. Be sure your quarterbacks are the ones that can thrive on it.
And Roger Dodger, I'm going to respectfully disagree with this comment because it's just not always true. We saw that with Purdue last year. He says if you have 2 QBs, then you have no QB. And that's a belief that I've heard a lot amongst Iowa fans for years. But I would guess that you would also somewhat disagree with that, Don?
I would. Purdue's a prime example. They played 2 quarterbacks last year, not just in our game. They played 3 in our game, but they played 2 quarterbacks in a lot of games. The backup has a skill set too, and they're not the only team that did it. As I recall,
prolific passing attack in the Big Ten other than Ohio State, right? Maybe the most prolific passing attack in the Big Ten other than OSU.
Well, you've heard me. I have a lot of respect for Jeff Brom. I think he's one of the brightest coaches in all of college football, and we have to play him every year. And he's proven every year that he's well above average.
Thank you for this, Lemansky. Appreciate the super. What is this, Mark? Is that a super sticker?
Super sticker.
Or a super
what
sticker?
That is, I don't know, but we appreciate it.
Okay. I don't know what it is either, for the record.
You know, very briefly, in regards to that adage about having 2 quarterbacks, and if you do, you don't have any. You know, I got to think that comes down to 2 things. I got to think that there's a leadership quality to the quarterback that's in play, unlike any other position. You know, you can have leaders play safety, play left tackle, but the quarterback should be a leader. He inherits a leadership role. And so it goes back to that. I got to think that saying goes back to when quarterbacks at the professional level called their own plays. And if you had 2 quarterbacks and you were shuffling them back and forth, maybe there was a lack of continuity in the offense. But that's been taken away from the quarterback a long, long time ago.
You know, here's another reason to have 2 quarterbacks. It's so easy for one quarterback to go down. You better have a capable backup because it's difficult to make it through a season with one quarterback. It's a violent game.
Yeah, I think what you brought up about Purdue is a perfect example because they don't have one elite quarterback. They have 3 good ones. So we don't need one guy in this race to be elite. You need all these guys to be good. And if they all bring something different. I think that's true. I think Spencer, let me say something really positive about Spencer. Don, I brought this up to you last year. I think he has, at least at times last year, he proved that he can throw the deep ball on target.
Right.
He can sit in the pocket and throw the deep ball on target. I do think he needs to improve on going through his progressions and making good reads and his decision-making. Some of his fundamentals were certainly a problem, and those things need to be worked on. But I'll give him credit for that. Alex Padilla gives you some mobility. We don't really know what Joey Labus gives us yet because we haven't seen him enough. But I do think it's a decent idea. I don't think we're going to see it at Iowa.